The only things he talked about were the national debt. He called them a betrayal of future generations. And then he railed against the trade policies. And he figured the rest of the issues were just the parties sort of pitting Americans against each other. 34 years ago, it was 34 years ago this summer, that a billionaire named Ross Perot warned that the North American Free Trade Agreement would create a giant sucking sound. He warned of this giant sucking sound as jobs were sucked out of American cities and they would go south for cheaper labor in Mexico. Of course, he was scorned. He was derided. Both major parties called him every name imaginable as they did everything they could to fend off this independent presidential bid in the 1992 race. Depending on whether you liked him or hated him, and there were people on both sides, Perot was seen as either a prophet or a doomsayer. For the 19% who ended up voting for Ross Perot for president, it turns out he was their only hope of staving off what they saw as the inevitable gutting of the American way of life. For Republicans and Democrats, Ross Perot was an existential threat. The two parties, this uniparty we sometimes call it, their power rests on the fact that they can only challenge each other. No one else is allowed to play. Outsiders aren't welcomed, and they're certainly not tolerated. You get in line, you play in the two-party system, or you get destroyed. Well, Ross Perot did not, in fact, get in line. So they tried to destroy him. Ross Perot was no doubt flawed. He was, after all, human. And all humans, unfortunately, are flawed. But flawed though he may have been as a person or even a political personality, he was also prescient. He was an outsider. And his core insight about concentrated economic pain was largely dismissed by the political elites and the expert consensus of the time. When Ross Perot ran for office, American manufacturing was still employing about 18 million people, give or take. You had steel towns in Pennsylvania. You had automotive towns all over the Midwest. And you had furniture towns all through the Carolinas, all up in upstate New York. And all of this rested on a truism. And the truism was this: if you worked hard, if you were willing to work hard, really hard, you could succeed. It was essentially a societal contract. A high school graduate could walk into a plant making steel, making auto parts, maybe making furniture, and he could fund a solidly middle-class life. He could raise a family. He could earn steady wages, buy a house. He could even retire with a pension. And there was no need to spend 4 years in college just to get in the front door. Every 18-year-old with even modest aptitude, as long as he had a desire to work hard, he could make a life for himself. And I'm using the he because that's how I write. He or she. But beneath this surface, corporatists and globalists were shuffling their capital because this was 1992, after all. This was the end of the Cold War. American factory workers at the time were running about $20 an hour by the time you factored in all the benefits, healthcare, retirement. Mexican workers, by contrast, were costing about $1 an hour for the exact same task. And that's the setting in which NAFTA was founded. That's the era in which it was forced onto unsuspecting American laborers. NAFTA, after all, sounded pretty good in theory. It was a proposed free trade zone. That trade zone would be the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It enjoyed pretty broad bipartisan support. Ronald Reagan actually dreamt it up. President George H.W. Bush then kind of negotiated it out, hammered out the details, and Bill Clinton ultimately signed it. Economists, editorial boards, both major parties, pretty much everyone largely agreed it would expand the economic pie. And then came Ross Perot. He was plain spoken in a Texas accent, and he flatly rejected that consensus. He had pretty good pedigree. He had been a top IBM salesman. He founded a company called Electronic Data Systems, and he built that into a data processing giant. He even once financed a private rescue of some of his employees. They'd been taken prisoner during the Iran Revolution in 1979. By 1992, he was fed up with the direction both major parties were going. He didn't like the future they were charting for the country. So he announced his campaign for president in the 1992 election. His campaign really only focused on two issues. You can go back and read all his materials. You can listen to all his speeches. You can watch movies about the man. He ran an entire political campaign basically on two issues. People the other day were saying, oh, Tucker Carlson, only 10 adverbs or adjectives. Well, it's 8 more than Ross Perot had. Ross Perot, the only things he talked about were the national debt. He called them a betrayal of future generations. And then he railed against the trade policies that he said would hollow out the country's industrial base. And he figured the rest of the issues were just the parties sort of pitting Americans against each other. He'd said he'd let Congress work those issues out and kind of go along with whatever they decided. I actually kind of like that idea from a president. The response to Perot's really simple 2-point platform was nothing short of explosive. Nothing before or since in presidential politics comes close to what happened virtually overnight. Ross Perot's simple message was digestible. It didn't matter if you dropped out of high school or you had a PhD. Everyone and anyone could grasp Ross Perot's message. His simplicity was the driver. Volunteers immediately began organizing in all 50 states because they had to get Ross Perot on the ballot. Polls even briefly showed him leading Bush and Clinton. He largely funded his own campaign. He took donations, but not big corporate donations because they basically hated him. And he did something really unprecedented. Instead of buying 30-second ads, he bought 30-minute blocks of primetime television. And he would deliver economics lectures. He'd have hand-drawn charts. He'd had a little pointer. He even published a book called Save Your Job, Save Our Country, Why NAFTA Must Be Stopped. And then in July of 1992, with the wind at his back and really doing well in the presidential race, he quit. He dropped out of the race. He said it was in the face of relentless attacks and threats against his family. And then he didn't campaign again until October. In October, he re-enters the race a couple of 3 weeks before the election. On a debate stage, October 15th, 1992, Ross Perot argued that once NAFTA passed, companies would simply compare the $12 to $15 an hour American factory labor, and they would look across the border and see that same labor could be purchased for $1 an hour in Mexico. And you didn't have to pay healthcare costs. You didn't have to comply with costly safety regulations. There were no real environmental controls, and you didn't have to fund a pension plan. The result, according to Ross Perot, would be a giant sucking sound of jobs moving south. The deal would not lift Mexican wages as much as drive American wages down. Nearly every mainstream economist pounced on him. Nearly every mainstream political talking head also pounced on Ross Perot. They called him simplistic. They called him foolish. They dismissed him as fear-mongering. They insisted free trade would create net gains and that any losers in the game of shuffling jobs around among countries, they could be retrained. We could teach them to do something else. Ross Perot got nearly 19% of the popular vote. No independent had come close to that level of support in more than 80 years. But he didn't win a single electoral vote. His broad appeal actually worked against him in that respect. Had he run a more regional campaign, he might have concentrated votes in particular states, and that would have at least allowed him to pick up some electoral votes. At the end of the election, Clinton won. NAFTA passed. It took effect on January 1st, 1994. And the giant sucking sound became a punchline. The year before NAFTA, the U.S.-Mexico goods trade balance was about equal. We imported about what we exported. That would never happen again. The balance shifted in Mexico's favor and picked up steam over the years. Auto parts plants, appliance makers, textile mills, furniture factories, they all relocated to Mexico. exactly as Ross Perot said they would. And the result was disastrous. Single plant towns watched their only plant leave. And then the suppliers packed up and left. And then the local businesses shut down. And then all the homes were foreclosed on. The industrial Midwest, the southeastern United States, they experienced a slow hollowing out. For those communities, that giant sucking sound Ross Perot warned about, it was not a punchline at all. The economy did grow in those years, but the American way of life did not. It most assuredly did not. On the heels of NAFTA was China. China became an entrant into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And that actually produced a greater loss of American manufacturing jobs as plants now decided to exploit China instead of just Mexico. Ross Perot recognized a reality that can't be seen on a spreadsheet. When corporatists and globalists chase lower wages across the planet, the economic pain is very much not evenly distributed. Losses concentrate on particular people. Those particular people have families. Those families had hopes and dreams, and those hopes and dreams are no longer reachable. The towns and jobs that formed the basis for their hopes and dreams, they were destroyed. Their dreams were destroyed right alongside their towns. Depression, drug use, and suicide replaced jobs, houses, and pensions. National averages have this nasty effect of masking the devastation. Experts set back and measure the averages, the total economic growth. Ross Perot didn't buy that. He spoke to the town. He spoke to the individuals that lost their only plant and their only economic driver in that area. He may have been eccentric, and he may have made an unforgiving blunder, frankly, by abruptly dropping out of the race only to jump back in a few weeks before the election. But it's hard to look back 34 years later and say that Ross Perot was wrong. He wasn't wrong. He was right. And he was right about almost everything. In 2016, Donald Trump actually ran on much of Ross Perot's platform. He ran on his messaging of the consequences of the so-called free trade agreements. He won Rust Belt states by promising to renegotiate those very trade deals that Ross Perot ran against back in 1992. NAFTA in 2020 was replaced by the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA. It actually incorporated some of the labor imbalance concerns that Ross Perot had raised back in 1992. The problem is that was only half of Ross Perot's platform. The national debt was the other half. Perot was worried about a $4 trillion national debt in 1992. That number's now 10 times higher. It's set to cross $40 trillion in the very near future. So it turns out Ross Perot was actually right about that part too. But he lost anyway, despite being right. And he lost because the two-party system and this symbiotic media apparatus that support each other, they ignored Ross Perot's arguments. They chose instead to mock him, mockery being the primary means by which the entire system protects itself. The system doesn't have to answer to questions it deems beneath entertaining. Perot had a whiny voice. He had an unconventional appearance for a presidential contender, so what could he possibly know about economics, right? But despite mocking Perot as Chicken Little, despite mocking him warning of this giant sucking sound, that line endures. The giant sucking sound endures. And it endures, if for no other reason, than most of those communities that heard the giant sucking sound, they watched the cause of the giant sucking sound destroy their American dream. And with it, it destroyed their entire way of life. And as depressing as an end as that is, that's your opening statement. I'm hopeful somebody will take up the cause at some point and try to correct the giant sucking sound. Donald Trump has tried a few things along the way. No one else has even tried. Most of his stuff has largely failed. But it'd be nice if somebody actually worried about the little guy for once. Don't worry about the stock market. Don't worry about GDP. Worry about Bill in Toledo. Worry about his family. What's going on with Bill? How's Bill doing today? Does he still have a mustache? Bill's a real person. He's a human being, and he matters.